Before we begin tonight's story, I want to thank you for joining us on Dark Appalachia. If you're watching this from somewhere in the mountain states, drop a comment below. There's something different about hearing these stories when you're close to where they happened. The wind sounds different in the hollows of West Virginia, doesn't it? The trees seem to lean in closer, as if they're listening too. And the shadows, they stretch longer in these mountains, reaching across time itself to touch both past and present. Tonight, we're traveling back to 1794 to a small settlement called Middleway. What happened there has been told as a ghost story for generations, but the truth, the human truth, is far more disturbing than any supernatural tale. Some of you might know this as the legend of the Wizard Clip, a supposed haunting that tormented a frontier family. But what if I told you the real horror wasn't ghostly at all, but born from the darkest corners of the human heart? What if the true story was about secrets, betrayal, and the terrible things people do when they believe no one is watching? Settle in, lock your doors, and remember, the most frightening monsters have always been the ones that look just like us. The year is 1794. The American Revolution has ended, but the frontier remains wild and unpredictable. Middleway sits nestled in a valley surrounded by dense forests that seem to swallow sound itself. The settlement consists of a handful of sturdy log homes, a general store, and a Lutheran meeting house. Most residents are German immigrants or their descendants, hard-working people who carved their lives from the wilderness with axe and determination. The winters here are harsh, isolating each family for months at a time. In such isolation, suspicion grows like moss on a fallen tree, slow but persistent, eventually covering everything. The settlers watch each other carefully, noting every small change or deviation from expected behavior. They depend on one another for survival, but trust doesn't come easily on the frontier. Among them is the Livingston family, Adam, his wife Martha, and their 3 children, Sarah, 18, Thomas, 15, and little Emma, just 6. They've lived in Middleway for only 3 years, having moved from a smaller settlement 30 miles east. Their arrival coincided with the mysterious departure of a French settler named Laurent Devereaux, though few made any connection between these events at the time. The Livingston home stands apart from the others, perched on a gentle rise overlooking Opequon Creek. It's larger than most, with 2 stories and a stone foundation that descends deep into the hillside. Adam has prospered as a farmer and occasional fur trader, though neighbors whisper that his success came too quickly. How did a man who arrived with barely a wagon of possessions build such a fine house in so little time? The property itself had once belonged to the vanished Frenchman, though Adam claims to have purchased it legitimately. The house has peculiarities that even Adam's pride cannot disguise. Rooms that seem to change size with the seasons, hallways that channel drafts even on still days, and a basement with walls of native limestone that weep moisture even in drought. The cellar is where Adam spends many evenings alone, working by lamplight on ledgers he keeps locked in an iron box. Martha has never asked what these ledgers contain. In marriages of that era, a wife might notice much, but question little, especially when her family's newfound comfort depends on her silence. Martha Livingston runs the household with precision and silence. She speaks little, even to her children, communicating more through gesture and expression than words. Her eyes, pale blue and watchful, miss nothing. Years of frontier hardship have taught her that survival depends on observation, noticing which plants cause rash, which neighbors steal, which clouds bring hail rather than gentle rain. Her hands are rough from work, with fingers permanently stained from wild berries used for dyeing cloth. These same hands can deliver a newborn calf, stitch a wound, or snap a chicken's neck with equal efficiency. The oldest daughter, Sarah, has inherited her mother's silence, but not her stillness. She moves constantly, her fingers always busy with needle and thread, creating intricate patterns on cloth. Her embroidery has become known throughout the valley for its unusual designs, not the typical flowers and birds, but complex geometric patterns that seem almost hypnotic when studied too long. She sells her work at the general store, keeping the money hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her room. At 18, she should have been married already, but suitable matches are scarce in Middleway, and Adam has rejected 2 offers from neighboring families without explaining why. Thomas helps his father with the farm and trapping. He's a serious boy who rarely smiles, his mind occupied with practical concerns, weather patterns, trap placements, the health of livestock. He speaks only when necessary, a trait that makes him seem older than his 15 years. The other children in Middleway find him strange and avoid him, spreading stories that he can predict when animals will die. In truth, Thomas simply notices signs others miss, the subtle changes in behavior that precede illness or injury. Little Emma, the youngest, exists in a world partially of her own creation. She collects buttons and bits of fabric, arranging them in patterns only she understands. She speaks to herself in whispers, carrying on conversations with imaginary companions she refers to as her quiet friends. Martha worries about the child's solitary nature, but cannot bring herself to forbid these imaginary relationships. The frontier offers few playmates, and Emma seems content in her isolation. The closest neighbor, Jacob Miller, lives a mile down the road in a cabin that leans slightly to the west, as if perpetually bracing against the winter wind. His wife died 3 winters ago, leaving him alone with bitterness and suspicion. He watches the Livingston place through his window each night, noting when their lamps are extinguished and when they're relit in the small hours. Miller rarely visits the settlement, preferring to trade directly with traveling merchants. The other settlers speak of him with a mixture of pity and unease, noting how his behavior has grown increasingly erratic since his wife's death. What few know is that Elizabeth Miller had been a friend to the vanished Frenchman, Devereux. She had visited his home often, fascinated by his collection of books and strange instruments. After his disappearance and her subsequent death, Miller became obsessed with the Livingston family, convinced they somehow carried responsibility for his losses. This was Middleway in 1794, a place of hard work and harder judgments, where prosperity invited suspicion and difference bred fear. Remember it as it was before the cutting began. The road connecting Middleway to the larger settlement of Shepherdstown saw little traffic in late autumn. Mud and early frost made travel difficult, and most people preferred to stay close to home as winter approached. The mountains loomed dark against the sky, their ridges already dusted with the first snow, a reminder that nature could isolate this valley completely with one heavy storm. So when a rider appeared on the Livingston property one November evening, it caused a stir. Thomas spotted him first, pausing in his work of splitting wood to watch the stranger's approach. The man rode slowly, his horse picking its way carefully along the rutted path. Even from a distance, Thomas could see something was wrong. The rider swayed in his saddle, clutching the pommel with white-knuckled hands. "Father," Thomas called, setting down his axe. "Someone's coming." Adam emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He shaded his eyes against the setting sun, studying the approaching figure with the wariness that was second nature to frontier dwellers. Strangers could bring news, trade goods, or trouble in equal measure. As the rider drew closer, the extent of his distress became apparent. The man was pale and sweating despite the cold, slumped forward on his horse. His clothes were finely made but soiled from travel, a broadcloth coat of urban cut, leather boots with silver buckles, and a waistcoat embroidered with an unfamiliar pattern. When he spoke, his accent marked him as foreign, perhaps French or Spanish, with consonants that softened at the edges and vowels that stretched like taffy. "I require lodging," he said simply, his voice strained as if each word cost him considerable effort. "I can pay." He reached with trembling fingers toward an inner pocket. "Presumably for money." Adam raised a hand. "No need to show your purse out here," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "We can discuss payment inside." He turned to Thomas. "Take the gentleman's horse to the stable and rub it down. It's near spent." The stranger dismounted with difficulty, almost falling before Adam caught his arm. Up close, the man's condition was even more alarming. His skin had a yellowish tint beneath its pallor, and his eyes were rimmed with red. He smelled of sickness and something else, a sharp chemical odor that reminded Adam of the tanner's yard. "My name is Adam Livingston," he said, supporting the man toward the house. "And you are?" "Selby," the stranger replied after a moment's hesitation. "Richard Selby, of Philadelphia." The name rolled awkwardly from his tongue as if newly tried on. Adam Livingston was not one to turn away paying customers. The family occasionally took in travelers for additional income, though Martha disliked having strangers under their roof. With winter approaching and supplies already purchased for the season, extra coin was always welcome. Martha stood in the doorway as they approached, her expression revealing nothing of her thoughts. She stepped aside silently to let them pass, her eyes taking in every detail of the stranger, the quality of his clothing, the tremor in his hands, the sweat beading on his forehead despite the November chill. "My wife, Martha," Adam said. "She'll show you to a room where you can rest before supper." Martha nodded once and gestured for the stranger to follow her. She led him through the main room with its large hearth and up the narrow stairs to the small guest room at the back of the house. It was sparsely furnished, a rope bed with a straw mattress, a washstand with pitcher and basin, a single chair, and a chest for storing clothing. The room's single window looked out over the creek, its waters reflecting the last light of day. "Water in the pitcher," Martha said, her words clipped. "Supper at sundown. Privy's out back." The visitor, who had given his name as Selby, nodded gratefully and sank onto the bed. "Thank you, madam. You are most kind." Martha left without replying, closing the door firmly behind her. In the hallway she paused, listening. From within the room came the sound of movement, not the usual noises of a weary traveler settling in, but something more purposeful. A lock clicking open, paper rustling, glass clinking against glass. Then silence, followed by a soft murmuring in a language she didn't recognize. Downstairs she found Adam at the table, counting coins from his pocket. "He's sick," she said, without preamble. "Fever, maybe worse." Adam looked up, his expression hardening. "Did he say what ails him?" "No, but I've seen that color before. Yellow skin, red eyes. Could be the marsh fever. Or just exhaustion," Adam countered. "He's traveled far by the look of him." Martha's gaze was steady. "If it's catching, the children, we need the money, Martha." Adam's tone ended the discussion. "With winter coming on and the grain stores lower than I'd like, he'll be gone in a day or two." Martha turned away, moving to the hearth where a pot of rabbit stew simmered. She stirred it mechanically, her mind occupied with darker thoughts. She had witnessed enough sickness on the frontier to recognize when death was approaching. This stranger, whatever his true name might be, was not long for this world, and Martha Livingston had lived long enough to know that death rarely traveled alone. It brought complications, questions, and sometimes danger to those left behind. The visitor's belongings were few. A leather satchel containing clothing, all of fine quality but showing signs of hard travel, a wooden box secured with a brass lock, and a small book bound in red leather, its pages covered in Latin text. The satchel and book he left in plain sight on the chest. The box he pushed under the bed, out of immediate view. That night Martha served a simple supper of rabbit stew and cornbread. The family and their guest ate in the main room, gathered around the oak table that Adam had crafted during their first winter in the house. Sarah and Thomas sat together on one bench, while Emma perched on a stool between her parents. The visitor sat across from them, the firelight casting deep shadows beneath his eyes and cheekbones, giving him a skull-like appearance. Selby ate little, pushing food around his plate without much interest. His hands trembled visibly, and a sheen of sweat covered his forehead, despite the coolness of the room. When Sarah offered him more bread, he startled violently, knocking over his cup. The water spread across the table like a map of an unknown country, seeping into the wood grain. "Forgive me," he whispered, dabbing at the spill with his sleeve. "The journey has tired me more than I expected." "Where are you traveling to, Mr. Selby?" Adam asked, refilling the visitor's cup from a pottery pitcher. "I seek a colleague in Baltimore," Selby replied after a moment's hesitation. A man of specific skills? A doctor? Martha asked, noticing how the man clutched his side when he thought no one was looking. Of a sort, Selby said with a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes, though his remedies are not found in apothecary shops. The family exchanged glances, but asked no more questions. In those days, a person's business was their own, especially on the frontier where many had reasons to leave their pasts behind. After the meal, Selby retired to his room, the wooden box tucked under his arm. He thanked them for their hospitality with formal politeness that seemed at odds with his disheveled appearance. "Strange man," Thomas commented, as his mother cleared the table. "Did you see how he held his spoon? Like he wasn't used to it." "That's enough," Adam said sharply. "Our guest deserves his privacy. He's paid good silver for it." Thomas fell silent, but his eyes remained thoughtful. He had noticed more than the man's table manners. The calluses on his hands were not those of a merchant or scholar, but of someone who worked with chemicals and fire. Thomas had seen similar marks on the hands of the gunsmith in Shepherdstown. As the family prepared for bed, a sense of unease settled over the house like the evening mist rising from Opequon Creek. Martha took longer than usual checking the doors and windows, testing each latch twice. Adam cleaned his hunting rifle at the table, though he had no plans to hunt the next day. Sarah sat by the dying fire, her embroidery forgotten in her lap as she stared into the embers. Only Emma seemed unaffected, playing contentedly with her collection of buttons, arranging them in concentric circles on the floor. "Look, Mama," she said, pointing to her creation. "It's a wheel that turns and turns but never goes anywhere." Martha glanced at the pattern and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November air. The arrangement was identical to a diagram she had glimpsed in the red book their visitor had carried, a circle of symbols surrounding a central figure. "Time for bed, Emma," she said, scooping the buttons back into their tin box. "You can play more tomorrow." That night, little Emma woke, screaming. The sound cut through the darkness like a blade, bringing the household instantly alert. Martha reached Emma's bedside first, finding her daughter rigid in bed, eyes fixed on the corner of the room where shadows gathered thickest. "He's standing there," Emma whispered, her voice unlike her usual childish tone. "The man with the scissors." Martha looked where Emma pointed, but saw nothing but darkness pooled in the corner like spilled ink. Yet a chill ran through her, raising gooseflesh on her arms. She lit a candle from the banked coals in the small fireplace, holding it high to dispel the shadows. The corner contained only the familiar furnishings: Emma's small trunk of clothes, a rag doll slumped against the wall, a wooden horse that Thomas had carved for his sister's last birthday. "There's no one there, child," Martha said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Just shadows playing tricks." Emma shook her head emphatically, her eyes still fixed on the corner. "He's standing there watching. He has scissors that make no sound when they cut, and he's smiling, but his mouth doesn't move." Martha sat on the edge of the bed and gathered Emma into her arms, feeling the child's heart racing like a trapped bird against her chest. "It was just a bad dream, little one. Dreams can't hurt you." "It wasn't a dream," Emma insisted, her voice muffled against her mother's nightdress. "He told me his name." Martha pulled back slightly, studying her daughter's face in the candlelight. "What name did he tell you?" Emma's eyes were wide, her pupils so dilated they nearly swallowed the blue of her irises. "He said he was Laurent, and that he's come home." Martha felt as though the floor had dropped away beneath her. Laurent, the name of the Frenchman who had vanished 3 years ago, before they acquired this property. The man whose name was never spoken in their household by unspoken agreement. Emma could not have known that name. She had been too young when they moved here, and no one in the family ever mentioned the previous owner. "You must have heard someone say that name in town," Martha suggested, her mind searching for rational explanations. Emma shook her head. "He told me himself, just now, and he said he's going to take back what's his." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "He said Father stole it, and stealing is a sin." Martha stayed with Emma until the child fell asleep again, telling herself it was just a nightmare. Children picked up more than adults realized. Emma must have overheard something in town or from a passing traveler. But as she returned to her own bed, Martha passed the guest room and paused. Through the door came the sound of whispering, a rapid, urgent murmur in a language she didn't recognize. It sounded like a conversation, yet she knew Selby was alone. Martha placed her ear against the door, trying to make sense of the sounds. The whispers rose and fell like waves against a shore, sometimes loud enough to distinguish syllables, other times fading to mere breath. Beneath the whispers came another sound, a rhythmic snipping like scissors cutting through fabric. She considered waking Adam, but decided against it. Her husband had little patience for what he called women's fancies, and would likely dismiss her concerns. Instead, she returned to bed, lying awake until dawn filtered through the shutters, bringing no comfort with its light. By morning, the visitor's condition had worsened considerably. He could barely rise from bed, and his skin had taken on a yellowish tint that Martha recognized from previous epidemics she had witnessed. Adam sent Thomas to fetch Middleway's closest thing to a doctor, Mrs. Shepherd, a midwife with knowledge of herbs and simple remedies. But before Thomas could return, Selby called Adam to his bedside. The room smelled of sickness and something else, a sharp chemical odor that made Adam's eyes water. Selby lay against the pillows, his breathing labored, his eyes sunken into dark hollows. "I am dying," he said plainly, his breath coming in short gasps. "I require a priest." Adam frowned, standing at the foot of the bed rather than approaching closer. "The Lutheran minister visits only once a month. He won't be back for 2 weeks." "Not Protestant," Selby said, clutching Adam's wrist with surprising strength when he finally stepped nearer. "Catholic. I need last rites." Adam pulled his hand away, his expression hardening. Among the Protestant settlers of Middleway, Catholicism was viewed with deep suspicion, a remnant of old European conflicts transported to the New World. "There are no papists in Middleway," Adam said, his voice cold. "The nearest Catholic church is in Hagerstown, a day's ride." "Then send for one immediately," Selby pleaded, his eyes wide with fear that seemed out of proportion to the simple religious request. "Before it's too late?" "It's already too late," Adam said, glancing meaningfully at the man's weakened state. "You won't last the day, and I won't have a papist in my home. Whatever sins burden your soul, confess them to God directly." Selby fell back against his pillow, his face contorted in terror that made Adam step back involuntarily. "You don't understand what you're doing," he whispered. "What will be unleashed? Nothing will be unleashed except your soul, and God will judge it as he sees fit," Adam replied, turning to leave. The man's religious panic was unseemly, and he had no patience for such displays. "Wait," Selby called weakly, his voice barely audible. He pointed to the locked box visible beneath the bed. "Inside, papers. They must be burned, all of them. Promise me." Adam hesitated, then nodded curtly. "If that's your dying wish." "And the book. It must be buried at a crossroads, with iron nails driven through it." This request Adam ignored as the ravings of a fevered mind. He left the room, troubled by the man's delirious talk and the strange coincidence of Emma's nightmare. When he returned an hour later with broth Martha had prepared, Selby was dead. His eyes were open, fixed on the ceiling, and his hands were curled like claws against his chest. Most disturbing of all, his lips were pulled back in what looked like a smile, revealing teeth stained yellow with whatever sickness had claimed him. Following frontier custom, they prepared to bury him quickly. With no relatives to notify and no way to preserve the body, death demanded immediate attention. Adam and Thomas wrapped the body in a sheet, and Martha instructed Sarah to go through the visitors' belongings for anything of value that might repay them for their trouble and burial expenses, a common practice in an era when currency was scarce and barter was the norm. The locked box proved impossible to open without breaking it, so Adam set it aside for later examination. The clothes would be cleaned and sold to the general store owner, who always needed inventory. The horse would fetch a good price in Shepherdstown when the roads cleared. As Sarah sorted through Selby's satchel, she found something odd, a collection of small cloth dolls, crudely made from scraps of fabric. Each doll had a name stitched across its chest in red thread. Some names she didn't recognize: Ambrose, Devereaux, Elizabeth. But one name made her blood run cold: Livingston. She quickly hid this doll in her apron pocket before showing the others to her father. Adam frowned at the strange collection. "Burn them," he ordered, his face paler than usual. "All of this man's possessions. I want nothing of his remaining in my house." They buried Selby that afternoon in unconsecrated ground behind the barn. No prayers were said over him. Adam claimed the man's papist leanings made Protestant prayers meaningless, and they knew no Catholic rituals. The red book was placed in his hands before the simple pine coffin was nailed shut, a concession to the dead man's apparent religious nature. But the box remained in the house, its lock resisting Adam's attempts to break it. As darkness fell, a wind rose from the west, carrying the first snow of the season. The family huddled inside, the fire built high against the growing cold. Sarah sat in the kitchen long after the others had gone to bed, the cloth doll hidden in her pocket, weighing on her mind like a stone. She finally took it out, examining it in the dying firelight. The craftsmanship was crude but effective. A featureless head, arms and legs suggested by simple stitching, and their family name embroidered across the torso in uneven letters. The fabric itself was unusual, finer than any available in Middleway, with a subtle pattern woven into it. She considered burning it as her father had ordered for the others. The fire still had enough embers to consume the small object. But curiosity stayed her hand. Why would the stranger have dolls with their names? What purpose did they serve? And why had he traveled to this remote place only to die in their home? Instead of destroying it, Sarah hid the doll in a tin box that had once held hard candies, which she then concealed beneath a loose floorboard in her room. If her father ever discovered she had disobeyed him, the punishment would be severe. But something about the doll and the dead man called to her, awakening questions she had never thought to ask about her family's sudden prosperity and their move to this isolated house. That night the cutting began. Martha woke first, roused by a strange sound, a rhythmic snipping like scissors through cloth. She lay still for a moment, trying to identify the source. Was it coming from outside? Perhaps an animal had gotten into the house, a raccoon or squirrel tearing at stored fabric for nesting material. But the sound was too regular, too deliberate for an animal. She lit a candle and gasped at what its light revealed. Her bed sheets had been cut into perfect strips, as though by an invisible hand. More disturbing still, the cutting continued before her eyes, the fabric parting in clean lines without any visible implement causing the separation. She screamed, waking Adam beside her. "What in God's name?" he muttered, sitting up abruptly. Then he too saw the phenomenon and fell silent, his face draining of color. Together they discovered that every piece of cloth in their bedroom was being methodically cut: curtains, clothing, even the rag rug beside the bed. The scissors themselves remained unseen, but the sound was unmistakable: snip, 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 like someone humming a children's rhyme. "It's him," Martha whispered, clutching Adam's arm with fingers that dug into his flesh like talons. "The dead man. His spirit is angry because you denied him his priest." "Nonsense," Adam replied, though his voice trembled. "There must be an explanation. Perhaps a prank, or some strange property of the fabric itself." "A prank?" Martha hissed. "Who would dare enter our bedroom to cut our belongings? And how could they do so without us waking? No, Adam, this is something else, something unnatural." Adam lit a lantern and held it high, examining the room carefully. "There must be an explanation," he repeated, but with less conviction. They checked on the children and found them unharmed, though Emma sat awake in bed, unsurprised by the commotion. "The scissors man is cutting," she said simply, her voice unnaturally calm. "He told me he would." "Who told you, Emma?" Martha asked, kneeling beside her daughter's bed. "Laurent," Emma replied, the foreign name rolling awkwardly from her childish tongue. "He says father took what wasn't his to take, and now he's taking it back, piece by piece." Adam paled at this, his hand tightening on the lantern. until his knuckles showed white. "That's enough, Emma. You had a nightmare?" "Nothing more." "It wasn't a nightmare," Emma insisted. "He was standing right there, watching you sleep. He had scissors that made no sound, but they could cut anything. Even the air itself." Adam turned away abruptly. "Back to bed, all of you. We'll sort this out in the morning." But none of them slept for what remained of the night. They sat in the kitchen, the one room seemingly untouched by the strange phenomenon, listening to the continuous snipping sounds that echoed through the house until dawn. By morning, every piece of fabric in the master bedroom had been reduced to strips and crescents. Bedding, clothing, curtains, even the leather cover of Martha's Bible, which had been cut into an intricate pattern resembling a spider's web. Yet the children's rooms remained untouched, as did the rest of the house. Adam, a practical man, looked for rational explanations. Perhaps rats had somehow chewed the fabric, but the cuts were too clean, too precise, and some were in patterns no rodent could create. And what could explain the sound of scissors they'd all heard throughout the night? "We must tell no one of this," Adam instructed his family over a tense breakfast. "People in town already think us strange for taking in that papist. If word spreads of this madness, we'll be outcasts." "But what if it happens again?" Martha asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if it's worse next time?" "There won't be a next time," Adam said with forced confidence. "It must have been something the stranger brought with him, some vermin in his belongings, perhaps. I'll burn everything he left behind." But news travels quickly in small communities, especially those as isolated as Middleway, where each household depends on others for survival. By midday, Jacob Miller had heard about the strange occurrence from Thomas, who'd been sent to borrow shears for cutting new bedding material. The boy had tried to follow his father's instructions to keep silent, but Miller had a way of extracting information, asking seemingly innocent questions that led Thomas to reveal more than he intended. Miller arrived uninvited at the Livingston home that afternoon, his curiosity overcoming his usual reticence. He knocked once and entered without waiting for a response, a breach of frontier etiquette that reflected his agitated state. "I heard you had some trouble," he said, standing awkwardly in the doorway. His eyes darted around the room, taking in the newly cut fabric Martha was attempting to salvage. "Thought I might be of help." Adam's face darkened with anger. "Thomas has a loose tongue. There's nothing wrong here that concerns neighbors." "The boy said nothing specific," Miller replied, stepping fully into the room, despite Adam's unwelcoming manner. "Just that you needed shears on account of some damage to your bedding. I filled in the rest myself." "What rest?" Adam demanded. "What exactly do you think happened here?" Miller's gaze was steady, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I think Laurent has returned in one form or another." The name hung in the air between them like smoke. Martha dropped the fabric she was holding, her hand flying to her throat. Adam took a step toward Miller, his hands clenching into fists. "That name is not spoken in this house," he said, through gritted teeth. "The Frenchman is gone, has been for 3 years. "His body is gone," Miller agreed, seemingly unintimidated by Adam's threatening posture. "But something of him remains, something that remembers." "Get out," Adam ordered, pointing to the door. "Take your superstitions elsewhere." Miller didn't move. "Show me where you buried the stranger," he said instead. "The one who died yesterday?" Adam hesitated, thrown by the change of subject. "Why?" "Because I suspect he was no stranger to this place," Miller replied. "And I think you know that too, Livingston." Reluctantly, Adam showed Miller to the crude grave behind the barn, where the earth still lay freshly turned. Miller knelt beside it, running his hands over the soil, as if reading something in its texture. "You should have listened to him," Miller said after a long silence. "About the priest, about the burning." "I don't hold with papist ritual," Adam replied stiffly. "And I don't see what business it is of yours how we handle our affairs." Miller looked up, his eyes reflecting the gray winter sky. "I don't hold with superstition," he said, "but my grandmother from the old country used to say that the unquiet dead can be appeased with the right offerings." "We're God-fearing Lutherans," Adam replied, his voice tight with controlled anger. "We don't make offerings to the dead." Miller shrugged, rising to his feet and dusting soil from his hands. Suit yourself, but if I were you, I'd open that box the man was so concerned about. Might tell you something useful. How do you know about the box? Adam asked sharply. Thomas mentioned it, Miller replied with a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. As I said, the boy has a loose tongue when properly questioned. After Miller left, Adam took a hammer and chisel to the brass lock on Selby's box. He worked in the barn, away from the house and Martha's watchful eyes. The lock was well crafted but eventually yielded to his persistent efforts. Inside the box, he found papers covered in strange diagrams, circles inscribed with symbols, drawings of plants and animals, lists of names. Some pages contained what looked like recipes, though the ingredients were unfamiliar to him, substances with Latin names, measurements and units he didn't recognize. One document caught his eye, a deed to a piece of land in Middleway, dated 3 years earlier. The owner's name was not Selby, but Laurent Devereaux. Adam's hands trembled as he read the document. It was the original deed to the property they now occupied, the deed he had believed destroyed in the fire that had conveniently consumed Devereaux's small cabin shortly after the Frenchman's disappearance. A deed that, if presented to authorities, would invalidate Adam's own claim to the land. More troubling was a folded letter addressed to someone called Brother Ambrose at a monastery in Maryland. It detailed Devereaux's plans to establish what he called a place of power in the Virginia territory, away from the prying eyes of authorities. The letter mentioned the work several times, though it never specified what this work entailed. It also referred to the woman with the gift for seeing patterns, who had become his assistant, a clear reference to Elizabeth Miller, Jacob's wife, whose death had coincided with Devereaux's disappearance. Adam sat back on his heels, his mind racing. If Selby was actually Devereaux, returned under a false name, why had he come to their house? Why not reveal himself immediately and reclaim his property? And why had he fallen ill so suddenly after arriving? Unless... Adam remembered the strange chemical smell that had surrounded the man, the yellow tinge to his skin. What if Devereaux had been poisoned before reaching their home? What if he had come seeking help, knowing he was dying? But who would have poisoned him? Jacob Miller was the obvious suspect, given his connection to Elizabeth and his strange behavior since her death. Had Miller recognized his wife's former associate and taken revenge for her suicide? Adam showed the papers to Martha, who crossed herself, a gesture he'd never seen her make before, and one that shocked him coming from his Lutheran wife. "Burn them," she said, her voice trembling. "Burn them now, all of them. And we should leave this place, Adam. It's not too late to start again elsewhere." "Leave?" Adam's voice rose in disbelief. "After all we've built here, because of some cut fabric and a dead Frenchman?" "No, Martha. This is our home now, bought and paid for." Martha's eyes narrowed at this. "Bought and paid for? Is that what you call it? I've never seen any money change hands, Adam. Never seen a proper deed with your name on it." Adam's face flushed with anger. "What are you suggesting, woman?" "I suggest nothing," Martha replied, her voice suddenly cold. "I merely observe what I've seen and what I haven't. 3 years ago we were poor but honest. Now we have this fine house, but at what cost?" Adam said nothing for a long moment. Then, "I did what was necessary for this family, for our children to have a better life than we had." "And what exactly was necessary?" Martha pressed, stepping closer to her husband. "What happened to the Frenchman, Adam? The truth now. After 3 years of silence, I deserve that much." Adam looked away, unable to meet her gaze. "I threatened to expose him," he admitted finally. "As a papist, a foreigner conducting strange experiments. He was already distrusted in town after the business with Elizabeth Miller. It wouldn't have taken much to turn the settlement against him completely." "So you blackmailed him," Martha said flatly, "for his land, his home." "He signed the deed over willingly," Adam insisted, "and then he left. Whatever happened to him after that was none of my concern." Martha studied her husband's face, searching for something, truth perhaps, or a flicker of the man she had married 20 years earlier, before hardship and frontier life had worn away his principles. "And now he's returned," she said quietly. "Whether as Selby or as something else, he's come back to claim what's his." Adam shook his head firmly. "Selby is dead and buried. And if he was Devereaux, then the Frenchman is finally gone for good. These papers are all that remain of his claim." He gestured to the documents spread on the table between them. "Once they're destroyed, there will be nothing to connect us to him or this property's past." Martha looked unconvinced, but didn't argue further. Adam gathered the papers and locked them back in the box, which he then hid in his personal trunk in their bedroom. He would burn them, yes, but not yet. Some of the diagrams intrigued him, as did the list of names that included several prominent citizens of Shepherdstown. Such information might prove useful in future negotiations. That night, the cutting resumed, this time in the children's rooms. Sarah woke to find her nightgown being sliced to ribbons while she wore it, though her skin remained untouched. The sensation was indescribable, fabric separating against her body without any pain or even physical contact. It was as if the cloth itself had decided to disintegrate according to some predetermined pattern. She remained perfectly still, afraid that any movement might cause whatever force controlled the invisible scissors to turn its attention from her clothing to her flesh. From down the hall came Thomas's shout of alarm, followed by Emma's high, thin laughter, a sound so unlike her usual childish giggle that Sarah felt her blood freeze. When she finally gathered the courage to move, Sarah found her brother in the hallway, holding the remains of his hunting jacket. The sturdy buckskin had been cut into an intricate pattern of overlapping circles, the craftsmanship so precise that no human hand could have accomplished it. "It was on the peg," Thomas said, his voice uncharacteristically shaky. "I watched it happen, just cutting itself apart with nothing touching it." From Emma's room came their mother's voice, tight with controlled fear. "Adam, come quickly." They found Martha kneeling beside Emma's bed, where the child sat surrounded by her collection of cloth dolls, now all cut into precise patterns, their stitched faces somehow appearing more lifelike in their dismemberment. Emma herself seemed unharmed, but her expression was vacant, her eyes fixed on the far wall, as if watching something only she could see. "She won't respond," Martha said, gently shaking her youngest child. "It's like she's gone somewhere else in her mind." Adam appeared in the doorway, his nightshirt torn to shreds, his chest and legs visible through the remnants. In any other circumstance, his disheveled appearance might have been comical. Now it only added to the atmosphere of unreality that had descended on the household. "We need to leave," Martha said, gathering Emma into her arms. "Now before it gets worse." Adam shook his head. "And go where? In the middle of the night, with snow falling? We'd freeze before reaching the nearest neighbor." The family gathered in the kitchen, the only room seemingly untouched by the phenomenon. They spoke in whispers, as though afraid of being overheard by whatever presence had invaded their home. "We must leave tomorrow," Martha insisted, cradling Emma, who had finally fallen into what appeared to be normal sleep. "This house is cursed." "And go where?" Adam demanded again, his voice rising in frustration. "This is our home, our land. I won't be driven out by tricks and superstition." "Tricks?" Martha hissed, careful not to wake Emma. "You saw what happened to Sarah's nightgown while she wore it. No human hand did that." "Then what did?" Adam challenged. "A ghost? The spirit of a papist Frenchman with magical scissors? Listen to yourself, woman." "I know what I saw," Martha replied, her tone leaving no room for argument. "What we all saw. And I won't risk our children's lives because of your pride or your fear of what the settlement will think." Sarah hadn't told them about the doll she'd found with their name on it. As her parents argued, she slipped away to her room, retrieving the tin box from beneath the floorboard. The Livingston doll remained intact, unlike the other cloth objects in the house. She examined it closely in the light of a candle stub, looking for some clue to its purpose. The fabric was unusual, finely woven linen of a quality not available in Middleway. The stitching of their name was precise, each letter formed with small, even stitches that spoke of considerable skill. What surprised her most was that the thread used for the name appeared to be hair, human hair, dark like her father's. Each night since finding it, she'd experimented, pushing pins into different parts of the doll, curious to see if the visitor had truly created some form of sympathetic magic. So far, nothing had happened, or so she thought. Now, with the house falling into chaos around them, she wondered if her actions had somehow triggered or directed the cutting phenomenon. She returned to the kitchen with the doll hidden in her pocket, unwilling to confess her disobedience to her already distressed parents. The family remained awake until dawn, huddled together for warmth and comfort, listening to the occasional snipping sounds that continued throughout the house. The cutting continued for 6 nights. Each evening at sunset, the invisible scissors would begin their work, targeting different items each time. The pattern changed, sometimes straight lines, sometimes curves, occasionally elaborate designs like snowflakes or leaves. The family began sleeping in shifts, hoping to catch sight of whatever caused the destruction. They never did, though the sound of scissors remained constant, sometimes accompanied by whispers in a language none of them recognized. By the 3rd night, they had taken to wearing only the simplest garments, knowing that anything more elaborate would likely be destroyed. They abandoned the bedrooms entirely, making pallets on the kitchen floor where the phenomenon seemed least active. Emma gradually emerged from her strange detachment, though she still spoke of the scissors man as if he were a familiar companion. "He's not angry at us," she told Sarah, as they huddled under a blanket that had so far escaped the cutting. "Only at Father. He says Father made promises he didn't keep." "What promises?" Sarah asked, keeping her voice low so their parents wouldn't hear. Emma shrugged. "I don't know, but the scissors are his way of showing Father what happens when you cut things that shouldn't be cut." "What things, Emma?" The child's eyes were solemn in the firelight. "Connections, agreements, lives." Word spread through Middleway despite Adam's attempts to keep the situation private. Some neighbors offered help, others kept their distance, fearing contagion of either disease or misfortune. The Lutheran minister was summoned from Shepherdstown, but could offer only prayers, which seemed to have no effect on the phenomenon. Jacob Miller visited daily, his initial skepticism giving way to fascinated horror as he witnessed the extent of the destruction. He brought food when it became clear the family could not safely use their own kitchen implements, and he offered his cabin as temporary shelter. "I know we've had our differences, Livingston," he said on the 5th day, watching as Adam examined yet another ruined shirt. "But no family should endure this alone." Adam's pride initially made him refuse Miller's offer, but as the cutting spread to furniture, upholstery, and even leather boots, Martha overruled her husband. They were preparing to leave for Miller's cabin when an unexpected visitor arrived, a Catholic priest named Father McBride, traveling from Maryland to a new parish in Kentucky. He'd heard about the Livingstons' troubles while passing through Shepherdstown and offered his assistance. Adam initially refused to let the priest enter his home. After the disaster with Selby Devereaux, he wanted nothing to do with Catholics or their rituals. But Martha, pushed beyond endurance by nearly a week of supernatural torment, overruled her husband. "I don't care if he's Catholic, Jewish, or Turk," she said with uncharacteristic forcefulness, her face haggard from lack of sleep. "If he can end this torment, we'll hear him out." Father McBride was a practical Irishman in his 50s, more concerned with people's welfare than doctrinal differences. His robust frame and ruddy complexion spoke of a man accustomed to hard travel and simple living. After hearing their story, he asked to see the visitor's grave and the papers found in his box. "This man was no ordinary traveler," the priest said after examining the documents in Devereaux's box. His weathered hands turned the pages carefully, pausing over certain diagrams with a frown. "These are a practitioner's papers, a student of the occult arts." "A witch?" Martha whispered, instinctively making the sign against evil, touching forehead, chest, and each shoulder in turn. "Something like that," McBride replied cautiously, clearly choosing his words with care. Though he would have called himself a natural philosopher or alchemist, these diagrams are for rituals designed to harness certain energies. "What does that have to do with the cutting?" Adam demanded, his patience worn thin by days of unexplainable phenomena and mounting fear. The priest pointed to one of the diagrams, a circle inscribed with symbols with what appeared to be scissors drawn at the 4 cardinal points. "This is a binding ritual. See these scissors drawn here? They represent severance, cutting ties between our world and elsewhere." "Are you saying he was holding something back? Something that's now been released?" Sarah asked, speaking up for the first time. She had been watching the priest carefully, noting how his expression changed when he examined certain pages. Recognition, then concern, then something close to fear. Father McBride studied her face carefully, as if assessing her reliability or strength of character. Perhaps the binding was incomplete when he died. Without proper closure, the energies he was working with remain active, seeking patterns to complete. What the priest didn't say, what he couldn't say to these frightened Protestants, was that the diagrams reminded him of forbidden texts he'd seen locked away in Rome during his seminary training, works attributed to dark practitioners who believed they could control forces beyond human understanding. The scissors were indeed a symbol of severance, but also of sacrifice, cutting away the profane to reveal the sacred, or, in darker workings, cutting open the veil between worlds. "What can we do?" Martha asked, her voice small with exhaustion and fear. "First, I should perform a blessing of the house," McBride said, reaching for the worn leather satchel he carried. "Then, if you'll permit, I'd like to give this man Devereaux a proper Christian burial with the rites he requested." Adam began to protest, his face flushing with anger at the thought of Catholic rituals being performed on his property. But Martha silenced him with a look that spoke volumes about her determination and desperation. "Do what you must, Father," she said simply. The priest spent the day blessing each room with holy water and prayers. He spoke in Latin for some parts of the ritual, switching to English for others. The family followed him from room to room, watching as he anointed doorways and windows with oil from a small silver vial. When he reached Sarah's bedroom, he paused, his expression troubled. He stood in the center of the room, turning slowly as if sensing something the others could not perceive. "There's something here," he said quietly. "Something hidden." Sarah's face flushed with guilt. She knelt and removed the floorboard, retrieving the tin box with the cloth doll inside. Father McBride opened the box and stared at the doll, his face growing pale beneath its weather-beaten tan. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice suddenly sharp. "It was among his things," Sarah admitted, unable to meet her father's angry gaze. "There were others, but my father burned them. I kept this one because it had our name." The priest carefully lifted the doll. Several pins protruded from its body, one in the head, one in the chest, one in each limb. His fingers traced the embroidered name on its chest, his expression grim. "Child, do you understand what you've been doing?" McBride asked, his voice tight with controlled fear. "I was just curious," Sarah replied defensively. "Nothing happened when I placed the pins." "Nothing you could see," the priest corrected her. But something was listening. Something was learning where to cut. Adam stepped forward, snatching the doll from McBride's hands. "This is nonsense. A child's poppet cannot cause what we've experienced." The priest's gaze was steady. "That is no ordinary doll, Mr. Livingston. It's a focus, a tool for directing energies. And your daughter has been unknowingly providing it with targets." "It's just cloth and thread," Adam insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. "Is it?" McBride asked quietly. "Look closer at the thread used for your name." Adam examined the doll, his expression changing as he realized what Sarah had already noticed, that the thread appeared to be human hair. "Hair provides a connection," the priest explained, "like calls to like, and the pins. They mark places of vulnerability, points where the veil between worlds thins." "What veil?" Martha asked, her arms wrapped protectively around Emma, who had been watching the exchange with unnerving calm. "Between life and death," McBride replied simply, "between this world and whatever lies beyond it." That evening, Father McBride led a small procession to Devereaux's grave. The body was exhumed, properly shrouded, and reburied with Catholic rites. The red book was removed from the corpse's hands and burned, along with all the papers from the box. McBride insisted that the cloth doll be buried separately at the crossroads east of town, with iron nails driven through it, as Devereaux had requested for his book. Throughout the ritual, Jacob Miller watched from a distance, his face unreadable in the gathering dusk. He had arrived as they began the exhumation, saying nothing but offering his assistance with the physical labor. Now he stood apart, a solitary figure against the darkening sky. As they walked back to the house, Sarah found herself beside Miller, separated from the others by a few paces. "Did you know him?" she asked quietly. "Devereaux, I mean, before he left." Miller was silent for so long that Sarah thought he hadn't heard her. Finally he said, "Yes, he was unusual, a learned man, out of place on the frontier." "And your wife, did she know him too?" Miller's step faltered, but he quickly recovered. "Why do you ask that?" "One of the dolls had her name," Sarah replied. "Elizabeth, and Emma mentioned connections being cut." Miller's face hardened. "My wife died by her own hand, if that's what you're implying, after she was shunned by this settlement for associating with Devereaux. Your father was particularly vocal in condemning her." Before Sarah could respond, they had rejoined the others at the house. That night, for the first time in a week, the Livingston home was silent. No scissors, no whispers, no destruction. The family slept deeply, exhausted by their ordeal and the day's activities. But Sarah couldn't sleep. She stood at her window, watching the road that led to the crossroads where they'd buried the doll. Something bothered her about Father McBride's explanation. If Devereaux had been a practitioner of dark arts, why would he have requested last rites? And why would proper burial have appeased whatever force was at work? Unless it wasn't Devereaux who had bound something with his rituals. What if he had been running from something? What if the scissors were not his tools, but his tormentors? Sarah dressed quietly and slipped out of the house. The night was clear and cold, the moon providing enough light to follow the road. Her breath clouded before her face as she walked, the frozen ground crunching beneath her boots. The crossroads lay a quarter-mile from their home, a simple intersection where the main road to Shepherdstown crossed a lesser track leading to the creek. When she reached the crossroads, she saw the freshly disturbed earth where they'd buried the doll. The grave was shallow, marked only by a small pile of stones Father McBride had arranged in the shape of a cross. Without fully understanding why, she knelt and began to dig with her hands. The earth was loose and gave way easily, cold against her skin but not yet frozen solid. Soon she uncovered the cloth doll, the iron nails gleaming dully in the moonlight. As she lifted it from its shallow grave, she heard it, the familiar snipping sound, though no scissors were visible. "I thought it might be you," said a voice behind her. Sarah whirled around, nearly dropping the doll in her surprise. Jacob Miller stood on the road, a lantern in one hand and a pair of scissors in the other. The moonlight transformed his familiar features, making them seem sharper, hungrier, a wolf's face on a human body. "Mr. Miller," she stammered, clutching the doll to her chest. "What are you doing here?" "The same as you, I expect," he replied, stepping closer. The light from his lantern cast grotesque shadows across the barren winter landscape. Looking for answers, Sarah took a step back, suddenly aware of her vulnerability. Alone at night, far enough from home that no one would hear if she called for help. "My father will worry if I'm gone too long," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Miller smiled, a thin stretching of lips that revealed teeth yellowed with tobacco. "I don't think Adam Livingston spares much worry for anyone but himself," he said. "But that's neither here nor there. Show me what you found." Sarah hesitated, then held out the doll. Miller stepped closer, holding the lantern high to examine it. The scissors in his other hand caught the light, their polished blades reflecting twin moons. "Interesting," he murmured, not touching the doll but studying it intently. "The needlework is familiar, very familiar indeed. Are you the one who's been cutting things in our house?" Sarah asked, her suspicion crystallizing into certainty as she watched his face. Miller laughed softly, the sound unnervingly gentle. "Not directly, but I did provide the means." He held up the scissors. These belonged to my wife. She was quite skilled with them, could cut the most intricate patterns. Snowflakes, leaves, silhouettes of children's faces. A cold realization washed over Sarah. The patterns cut into their belongings had been too precise, too artistic to be random destruction. They had been created, designed with an aesthetic sensibility that spoke of human intention. "Your wife didn't die 3 years ago, did she?" she asked, the pieces falling into place in her mind. "Oh, she died," Miller said, his voice hardening like water freezing over. "But not from fever, as I told everyone. She died because she learned too much about our new neighbor, the Frenchman who bought the old Weaver property, the property your father later acquired at a suspiciously low price." Sarah took another step back, the doll still clutched protectively against her chest. "I don't understand." "Laurent Devereaux was my friend," Miller said, his words forming small clouds in the cold air, "a man of learning and vision. He came here to study the unique properties of this valley, the way the limestone channels certain energies, the unusual magnetic variations. My wife assisted in his work, learning his methods. I think he loved her in his way." His face twisted with a mixture of grief and rage that made Sarah flinch. "Your father discovered them together. He assumed the worst, that they were lovers. He threatened to expose Devereaux as a witch unless he left Middleway forever. But Devereaux couldn't leave his work unfinished. So they made a bargain." "What kind of bargain?" Sarah whispered, though she feared she already knew. Her father's sudden prosperity, their new home, the strange documents in the locked box, all pieces of a puzzle she had never been meant to solve. "Devereaux would sign over his property to your father. In exchange, Adam would keep silent about what he'd seen, but your father broke his word. He spread rumors about strange doings at the Weaver place. My wife was shunned. Devereaux was forced to flee. And then my Elizabeth. She couldn't bear the isolation, the accusations. She used her sewing scissors on herself." His voice broke, a crack that revealed depths of pain Sarah had never imagined existed in the taciturn neighbor. "I found her surrounded by perfect circles of her own blood." Sarah felt sick. Her father had never mentioned owning the Weaver property before their current home. But it explained their sudden prosperity 3 years ago, their move from a modest cabin to their present house with its fine furnishings and ample land. "When Devereaux returned, I knew he'd come to make things right," Miller continued, moving closer until Sarah could smell the tobacco and whiskey on his breath. "He'd mastered new techniques during his exile, ways to bind spirits to objects, to direct their energies. He'd created those dolls as vessels. The cutting was Elizabeth's signature. She always loved to cut patterns." "But why target our family? Why now?" Sarah asked, fighting to keep her voice steady as her mind raced through implications and possibilities. "Because your father killed him," Miller said simply, his tone matter-of-fact, as if discussing the weather rather than murder. "The fever was real, but the decline was too rapid. I recognized the symptoms. Nightshade poisoning. Adam saw a chance to eliminate the last witness to his treachery." Sarah shook her head in denial, but doubt had taken root in fertile soil. Her father had been alone with Devereaux several times. He'd insisted on preparing the visitors' meals himself, claiming Martha was too busy with household tasks. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice small against the vast winter night. Miller held out his hand. "Give me the doll. Let Elizabeth finish what she started. And then what? More cutting? More destruction?" "Justice," Miller said, his eyes reflecting the lantern light like a predator's. The truth revealed, like fabric cut away to show the pattern beneath. Sarah hesitated, looking down at the doll in her hands. The face was featureless, but in the moonlight the stitches seemed to form an expression of patient malice. The iron nails piercing its body gleamed like tiny weapons. "I need to think," she said, taking another step back. Miller's expression darkened. "There's no time for thinking, girl. Elizabeth grows stronger each night. Soon she'll be able to cut more than just fabric." The implication hung in the air between them. Sarah suddenly understood the progression of the cutting, from bedding to clothing to items in direct contact with skin. Whatever force Miller had unleashed was working its way closer to the family themselves. "You're using my father's crime to justify your own," Sarah replied, backing away further. "Whatever Devereaux and your wife were practicing, whatever they awakened, it's not natural, it's not right." "Who are you to say what's natural?" Miller demanded, stepping into the crossroads after her. The lantern swung in his hand, casting wild shadows that seemed to move independently across the frozen ground. "The world is full of forces beyond our understanding. Elizabeth found a way to touch them, to use them. And now she's become something more than human." Sarah turned and ran, clutching the doll to her chest. She heard Miller curse and follow, his heavy footsteps pounding on the packed earth of the road. She ran blindly, leaving the road for the cover of trees, hoping to lose him in the darkness. The branches tore at her clothes and hair, but she pushed on, driven by instinct and fear. Eventually she broke through the tree line and found herself at the edge of Opquan Creek, its waters black in the moonlight. The creek was not completely frozen. The center still flowed, dark water moving silently beneath a crust of ice along the banks. With nowhere else to go, she waded in, gasping at the cold that bit through her boots and stockings. Miller emerged from the trees, his lantern casting long shadows. His face was flushed with exertion and something else, a wild excitement that frightened Sarah more than his anger. "There's nowhere to go, girl," he called. "Give me the doll, and I'll let you live. Your father is the one who deserves punishment, not you." "You're using my father's crime to justify your own," Sarah replied, backing deeper into the creek. The water now reached her waist, numbing her lower body with its icy embrace. "Devereaux and your wife were practicing dark arts. Whatever they awakened, whatever Elizabeth has become, it's not natural. It's not right." "Who were you to say what's natural?" Miller demanded, stepping into the creek after her, seemingly oblivious to the cold. "The world is full of forces beyond our understanding. Elizabeth found a way to touch them, to use them, and now she's become something more than human." As if in response to his words, the scissors sound began again, loud and insistent, coming from everywhere and nowhere. Sarah felt her dress beginning to cut itself, the fabric falling away in precise patterns, yet she felt no blades against her skin, only the cold water replacing the protection of her clothing. "She's here," Miller said, his face transformed with something like ecstasy. "My Elizabeth, she's come for her vessel." The cutting sound intensified. Sarah watched in horror as Miller's clothes began to shred, revealing pale skin beneath. But unlike her experience, his flesh did not remain untouched. Thin red lines appeared on his chest, arms, and face, perfect cuts that beaded with blood before being washed away by the creek water. Miller didn't cry out. He smiled, extending his arms as if in welcome. "Yes," he whispered, "take me too. Make me like you." The invisible cutting continued, growing more frenzied. Miller's skin parted in ever more intricate patterns, blood flowing freely now. Still he made no sound of pain, his eyes fixed on something Sarah couldn't see. The water around him began to darken with his blood, black in the moonlight. In that moment of distraction, Sarah plunged the doll underwater, holding it beneath the surface with both hands. She felt it struggling against her grip, not as an inanimate object, but as something alive and furious. The creek water around her hands began to churn and bubble. Miller screamed then, a sound of pure anguish. "No! What are you doing?" "Sending her back," Sarah gasped, fighting to keep the doll submerged. "Water dissolves the bindings. Father McBride told me." This was a lie. The priest had said no such thing. But Sarah had noticed how carefully Miller kept the doll away from the creek water. And she remembered something from her grandmother's stories, that running water could break enchantments, wash away curses. It was a desperate gamble, born of instinct rather than knowledge. Miller lunged toward her, but his lacerated body betrayed him. He stumbled and fell face first into the creek. When he didn't immediately rise, Sarah realized with horror that he couldn't. His tendons had been severed by the invisible scissors, leaving him unable to lift himself from the water. She watched, frozen in place by shock and the creek's numbing cold, as he drowned just feet away from her. His struggles were brief. Weakened by blood loss and the freezing water, he succumbed quickly. The doll in her hands gave one final surge of resistance, then went still. The cutting sound faded, replaced by the normal noises of the night. Frogs calling, water flowing, wind in the trees. Sarah remained in the creek until dawn, her body numb with cold but her mind strangely clear. As the first light broke over the eastern ridge, turning the frost-covered landscape into a sea of diamonds, she finally released the doll. It floated momentarily, then sank beneath the surface, lost in the deeper channel. Miller's body had been carried downstream, coming to rest on a sandbar 30 yards away. Sarah didn't approach it. Instead, she waded back to shore and began the long walk home, her wet clothes freezing against her skin. Each step was agony, her feet and legs so numb she could barely feel them. But she pressed on, driven by a need to reach home, to see her family safe. When she reached the Livingston house, she found her family in turmoil. During the night, every document in Adam's trunk had been shredded, including the deed to their property and, most damning of all, a promissory note to Laurent Devereaux with Adam's signature and a date corresponding to the day before Devereaux's departure 3 years earlier. Martha confronted her husband, her quiet demeanor shattered by rage and betrayal. The children listened from the stairway as their father confessed, not to murder, but to blackmail and deception. Yes, he had threatened Devereaux. Yes, he had taken the man's property in exchange for silence. And yes, he had broken his word, spreading rumors that drove Elizabeth Miller to suicide. "But I didn't poison him," Adam insisted, his face haggard with exhaustion and fear. "I swear on my soul, I didn't kill him." Sarah believed him, not because of his oath, but because she had seen the true architect of Devereaux's death in Miller's eyes last night. Miller, who had befriended the returning Devereaux, gaining his trust. Miller, who had access to his food and drink. Miller, who needed Devereaux dead to complete the binding of Elizabeth's spirit to the dolls. She said nothing of this to her family, nor did she mention Miller's death, though his body would surely be discovered soon. Instead, she went to her room and began packing her belongings. She could not stay in this house, with its secrets and lies, its memories of invisible scissors cutting through the fabric of their lives. By noon, Jacob Miller's absence had been noted. A search party found his body in the creek, his skin carved with patterns so intricate and numerous that those who saw him said he resembled delicate lace more than a man. The official determination was that he had fallen while drunk and suffered a bizarre accident, perhaps attacked by some unknown water creature with claws or teeth. No one connected his death with the strange events at the Livingston house. The cutting had stopped, and in frontier communities, people preferred rational explanations to supernatural ones, even when the rational stretched credibility to its limits. The Livingston family's reputation never recovered from the scandal of Adam's dealings with Devereaux. The property deed, destroyed that night, could not be proven legitimate. They were forced to sell their home at a fraction of its value and leave Middleway forever. They traveled west, eventually settling in Ohio under a different name. Sarah never married. She lived with her sister Emma until the younger woman's death in childbirth at 20. She then raised Emma's daughter as her own, teaching her to sew and to recognize the patterns in nature that others missed. She never again used pins in her sewing, preferring knots that could not be easily undone. And if sometimes, late at night, Sarah thought she heard the sound of scissors snipping, she never mentioned it to anyone. Some patterns, once recognized, are best left unspoken. By noon, Jacob Miller's absence had been noted. A search party found his body in the creek, his skin carved with patterns so intricate and numerous that those who saw him said he resembled delicate lace more than a man. The official determination was that he had fallen while drunk and suffered a bizarre accident, perhaps attacked by some unknown water creature with claws or teeth. The Livingston family's reputation never recovered from the scandal of Adam's dealings with Devereaux. The property deed, destroyed that night, could not be proven legitimate. They were forced to sell their home at a fraction of its value and leave Middleway forever. They traveled west, eventually settling in Ohio under a different name. Sarah never married. She lived with her sister Emma until the younger woman's death in childbirth at 20. She then raised Emma's daughter as her own, teaching her to sew and to recognize the patterns in nature that others missed. And if sometimes, late at night, Sarah thought she heard the sound of scissors snipping, she never mentioned it to anyone. Some patterns, once recognized, are best left unspoken. The house in Middleway still stands, though it has changed hands many times over the centuries. Current owners report no supernatural occurrences, though they do note an odd acoustic phenomenon. Certain rooms seem to amplify the slightest sounds, while others swallow noise completely. Local historians dismiss the wizard clip legend as frontier superstition, a tale born from the religious tensions of the era. They point to rational explanations: rodent infestations, chemical contaminants in well water causing hallucinations, or simple group hysteria. Yet visitors to the area sometimes report a strange experience. While walking along Appalachian Creek at dusk, they hear what sounds like scissors cutting fabric, though no one is visible. The sound follows them for a time, then fades as they leave the water's edge. Is it just the peculiar acoustics of the valley, the rustle of certain reeds in the wind, or something else, a pattern still seeking completion after more than 2 centuries? In Middleway Cemetery, there is a grave marker with no name, only a pair of scissors carved into the stone. No records indicate who lies beneath it or who commissioned the marker. Local children avoid it, claiming that if you stand near it at sunset, you'll feel something tugging at your clothes, testing the fabric. As with all stories from the Appalachian hollows, the truth lies somewhere between history and myth, in that shadowed valley where human darkness needs no supernatural explanation to terrify. The most disturbing hauntings, after all, are not those of spectral visitors, but of our own capacity for deception, betrayal, and vengeance. Patterns cut into the fabric of communities that never fully heal, even after generations have passed.